only meant to retrieve a necklace. But what she found behind the open safe changed everything. A detective, a secret, a choice between loyalty and betrayal. What would you do if your family's fate and someone else's depended on your silence? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in a steady rhythm against the cobblestones of Boston's financial district, creating a symphony that matched the nervous beating of Eleanor Thorne's heart. It was the autumn of 1903, and the young woman stood before the imposing granite facade of the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank, her gloved hand trembling slightly as she clutched a leather satchel against her chest. The gas lamps along Tremont Street flickered through the evening mist, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror her inner turmoil. Eleanor was 24 years old, with auburn hair pinned elegantly beneath a navy blue hat adorned with a single peacock feather. Her green eyes, usually bright with determination, now reflected uncertainty and something else, a desperate resolve born of impossible circumstances. She wore a tailored walking suit of dark wool, appropriate for a woman of her station as senior bookkeeper at Morrison & Sons Textiles, though the fine quality of her clothing belied the financial catastrophe that had befallen her family. Taking a deep breath that misted in the cold October air, Eleanor pushed through the heavy oak doors of the bank. The interior was all dark wood paneling and polished brass, with electric lights, still a relative novelty, casting a warm glow over the marble floors. The scent of leather, paper, and furniture polish filled her nostrils as she approached the main counter, where a young clerk looked up from his ledger. "Good evening, miss. The bank closes in 15 minutes, he said politely, adjusting his spectacles. "I need to access my family's safety deposit box," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Box number 47. The name is Thorne." The clerk consulted his records and nodded. "Of course, Miss Thorne, if you'll follow me to the vault room." As Eleanor followed the clerk through the banking hall, she was acutely aware of every sound. The ticking of the grand clock on the wall, the scratch of pens on paper from the few remaining customers completing their transactions, the rustle of her skirts against the floor. Her mind raced with the weight of what she was about to do. Her father, Thomas Thorne, had been a respected shipbuilder until a fire had destroyed his primary warehouse 6 months ago. The insurance company had refused to pay, claiming negligence, and her father had been forced to take loans from dangerous men to keep his remaining workers employed. Now those men wanted their money, and they had made it clear what would happen if payment was not received by tomorrow morning. Eleanor's younger brother James, only 16 years old, had been followed home from school yesterday by 2 rough-looking men. The message was unmistakable. Her father had confessed everything to her last night, his proud shoulders slumped in defeat, tears streaming down his weathered face. He had already sold everything of value, except for one thing. In safety deposit box 47 lay her late mother's diamond necklace, a family heirloom worth several $1,000s. It had been her mother's dying wish that Eleanor wear it on her wedding day, but there would be no wedding if her brother was harmed or her father destroyed. Eleanor had made her decision. She would take the necklace, sell it to a jeweler she knew who asked few questions, and deliver the money to save her family. The cost to her heart was a price she was willing to pay. The vault room was a circular chamber with walls lined with brass-fronted boxes of various sizes. The clerk used Eleanor's key in combination with the bank's master key to open box 47. He withdrew a long metal box and placed it on the mahogany table in the center of the room. "I'll give you privacy, Miss Thorne. Ring the bell when you're finished," the clerk said, bowing slightly before departing and closing the heavy door behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the vault room, her hands resting on the cold metal of the box. She hadn't yet opened it when she heard something, a sound that shouldn't have been there. A soft scraping, metal against metal, coming from somewhere behind the wall of deposit boxes. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then she heard voices, low and urgent, speaking in hushed tones that barely carried through the thick walls. Her curiosity overcoming her caution, Eleanor moved quietly toward the source of the sound. On the far side of the circular room, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar, she noticed something peculiar. One of the larger deposit boxes, number 93, stood slightly ajar. Its door hung open perhaps 2 inches, and through the gap she could see not the interior of a box but darkness and the faint flicker of light from beyond. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the open box. She should call for help. She should ring the bell and summon the clerk. Instead, driven by an instinct she couldn't name, she carefully pulled the door wider. The entire box mechanism swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing not a repository for valuables, but a passage, a narrow opening that led into the wall itself. The voices grew clearer now. Two men, speaking urgently about a shipment and a deadline. Eleanor recognized the terminology of criminal enterprise, the careful dance of words meant to obscure illegal activities. She leaned closer to the opening, straining to hear, when suddenly a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed her wrist. Eleanor gasped, but before she could scream, she was pulled through the opening with surprising gentleness. She stumbled into a narrow corridor lit by a single electric bulb and found herself staring up into the most striking pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. The man who had pulled her through was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders evident even beneath his well-tailored charcoal suit. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his clean-shaven face bore the firm, angular features of someone accustomed to command. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a presence that immediately commanded attention and respect. "Don't make a sound," he whispered urgently, his voice a low baritone that sent an unexpected shiver through her. His grip on her wrist was firm but not painful, and she could feel the calluses on his palm, hands that knew work despite his gentleman's appearance. Eleanor nodded mutely, too shocked to do otherwise. The man studied her face for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to catalog every detail of her features. She saw calculation there, and something else, concern, perhaps, or the weight of a difficult decision being made in an instant. "Who are you?" she finally managed to whisper. "Detective James Hartley, Boston Police Department," he replied quietly, releasing her wrist and reaching into his jacket to show her a badge. "And you've just stumbled into the middle of an investigation that's taken 6 months to set up." Eleanor's mind reeled. A detective, the open safe, the hidden passage. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. Hartley glanced back down the narrow corridor where the voices had fallen silent. "This passage connects to the building next door, a warehouse that's being used as a front for a smuggling operation. We've been tracking a criminal organization that's been bringing in opium and stolen goods through the harbor. They've been using this bank as a way to move money and valuables without detection. The bank manager is complicit." "Mr. Caldwell?" Eleanor said in disbelief. She had met the bank manager several times, a portly gentleman with silver mutton chops who seemed the very picture of respectability. "The same," Hartley confirmed. "He had this passage constructed under the guise of renovation work 2 years ago. We only discovered it 3 weeks ago, and I've been working to gather enough evidence to arrest everyone involved. But if they discover this entrance has been compromised..." He left the implication hanging. Eleanor felt her knees weaken as the full implication struck her. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I only came to access my family's box. I heard sounds and I was curious. I've ruined everything, haven't I?" Detective Hartley's expression softened slightly as he looked at her frightened face. "Not necessarily. But I need you to trust me and do exactly as I say. Can you do that, Miss Thorne? Eleanor Thorne. Miss Thorne, I'm going to escort you back through that opening. You're going to complete whatever business brought you here, and then you're going to leave the bank as if nothing unusual happened. Can you manage that?" Eleanor thought of her family, of the necklace she had come to retrieve, of the dangerous men waiting for payment. She thought of this detective and his investigation, and the criminals who would surely escape if she caused a disturbance now. The weight of multiple impossible choices pressed down on her shoulders. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I can do that." Hartley nodded, a flicker of what might have been admiration crossing his features. "Good. But before you go, I need to know. Will you keep this secret? Lives depend on the success of this investigation, Miss Thorne. I'm asking you to trust a stranger with something that clearly troubles your conscience. But I promise you, what we're doing here is crucial." Eleanor met his gray eyes and saw the sincerity there, the dedication of a man who believed deeply in his purpose. She had grown up learning to read people in her father's business dealings, and every instinct told her that James Hartley was a man of honor. "I'll keep your secret, detective. You have my word." "Thank you," Hartley said, and the genuine gratitude in his voice touched something deep in her chest. He guided her back to the opening, checking to ensure the vault room was still empty. "One more thing, Miss Thorne. If you ever need help, for any reason, you can find me at the Central Police Station on Pemberton Square. Ask for Detective Hartley." Their eyes met once more in that narrow space, and Eleanor felt a strange connection spark between them. Two people bound together by secrets and circumstance, by a moment of trust given and accepted. Then she was stepping back through the opening into the vault room, and Hartley was carefully closing the false deposit box door behind her, returning it to its nearly closed position that had first caught her attention. Eleanor stood in the quiet vault room, her heart still racing, and tried to compose herself. She returned to the table where her family's box waited and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside lay the diamond necklace, glittering cold and bright in its velvet case. She lifted it out, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the weight of her mother's memory, her own shattered dreams, and now this new burden of knowledge about corruption and crime in the very institutions meant to protect honest citizens. She placed the necklace in her satchel, returned the empty box to the clerk, and walked out of the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank into the rain-soaked Boston evening. The street lamps glowed through the mist like distant stars, and Eleanor pulled her coat tighter against the cold. She had come here prepared to sacrifice her mother's memory to save her family. She was leaving with the necklace still in her possession, but with knowledge that felt equally heavy, knowledge of a detective named James Hartley, of corruption and courage, of a moment when two strangers had trusted each other in the darkness. As she hurried toward the jeweler's shop on Charles Street, Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of those gray eyes, or the quiet strength in Detective Hartley's voice when he had asked for her trust. She had given it, and in doing so, she had become part of something larger than her own troubles. For the first time since her family's crisis began, Eleanor Thorne felt something other than despair. She felt purpose, and the strange, unexpected hope that perhaps not all was lost in a world where men like James Hartley still fought for justice. The rain continued to fall as Eleanor disappeared into the evening crowds, carrying with her a secret that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Behind her, in the hidden passage of the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank, Detective James Hartley stood in the darkness, thinking about the auburn-haired woman with the frightened green eyes who had stumbled into his investigation and chosen to protect it rather than expose it. He had seen something in her face, a nobility of spirit, a courage born of desperation, but tempered with integrity. He found himself hoping he would see Eleanor Thorne again, though he knew such thoughts were unprofessional and dangerous for a man in his position. Still, as he turned back to his surveillance of the criminals in the warehouse, James Hartley could not quite dismiss the memory of her face, or the way his heart had responded to her quiet promise to keep his secret. 3 days had passed since Eleanor's encounter in the bank vault, and she had not been able to stop thinking about Detective James Hartley. She had sold her mother's necklace to the jeweler on Charles Street for considerably less than its worth, but enough to satisfy her father's creditors and buy the family time to rebuild. Her father had wept when she brought him the money, never knowing the true sacrifice she had made. She told him she had sold some bonds her mother had left her, and he had accepted the lie with the desperate gratitude of a drowning man grasping a rope. Now, on this crisp November morning, Eleanor sat at her desk at Morrison & Sons Textiles, trying to concentrate on the ledgers before her. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building overlooking Boston Harbor, and through the tall windows she could see merchant ships moving through the gray waters, their smokestacks painting dark lines against the cloudy sky. The clacking of typewriters and the murmur of male voices discussing shipments and invoices filled the air, but Eleanor's mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing that moment in the vault, the open safe that wasn't really a safe at all, but a doorway. The detective had left it open on purpose, she realized now. It was a test, or perhaps bait for the criminals he was watching, and she had walked right into the middle of it. The thought made her alternately cold with fear and warm with a strange excitement she didn't fully understand. "Miss Thorne, Mr. Morrison wants to see you in his office immediately." Eleanor looked up to find Thomas Brennan, the company's senior clerk, standing before her desk. He was a thin man in his 40s with a perpetually worried expression and ink stains on his fingers. "Did he say what it concerns?" Eleanor asked, rising from her chair and smoothing her skirt. "He didn't confide in me," Brennan replied with a sniff of wounded pride. "But there's a gentleman with him, a police detective, I believe. They've been speaking in low tones for the past 20 minutes. Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. A detective? Could it be Hartley? Had something gone wrong with his investigation? Had she been seen, and now they were both in danger? She forced herself to breathe calmly as she walked down the narrow corridor to Morrison's corner office, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. She knocked twice on the frosted glass door, and Morrison's gruff voice called out, "Enter." Eleanor stepped into the office and immediately met the gray eyes of Detective James Hartley. He was standing beside Morrison's massive oak desk, looking even more imposing in the morning light that streamed through the harbor-facing windows. He wore a dark blue suit today, with a silver watch chain visible across his vest, and his expression was professionally neutral. But when their eyes met, Eleanor saw a flicker of recognition and something else, perhaps relief or concern. "Ah, Miss Thorne," said Edmund Morrison, rising from behind his desk. He was a portly man of 60 with white hair and a red face that suggested too much port wine and rich food. "This is Detective Hartley from the police department. He has some questions regarding a matter at the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank. I assured him that you are our most trustworthy employee and would cooperate fully." "Of course," Eleanor managed, her mouth suddenly dry. She looked at Hartley, trying to read his intentions in his carefully composed features. "Mr. Morrison, if you don't mind, I'd prefer to speak with Miss Thorne privately," Hartley said, his voice professionally courteous but firm. "It's standard procedure in these matters." Morrison looked displeased but nodded. "Very well, you may use the small conference room next door. Miss Thorne, I expect you back at your desk within the hour. We have the quarterly reports to complete." "Yes, sir," Eleanor replied. Hartley gestured for her to precede him out of the office, and Eleanor felt his presence behind her as they walked the few steps to the conference room. It was a small, windowless space with a single table and 4 chairs, used primarily for private meetings with clients. Once inside, Hartley closed the door and turned to face her. "Miss Thorne, I apologize for the intrusion at your workplace," he said quietly, and now his professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. "But I needed to speak with you urgently, and I couldn't risk sending a message that might be intercepted." "What's happened?" Eleanor asked, her hands gripping the back of a chair for support. "Has your investigation been compromised?" "Not yet, but it's about to be," Hartley said grimly. He moved closer, and Eleanor caught the scent of bay rum and leather. "The criminals we've been watching are planning to move their entire operation tomorrow night. We've learned they've been tipped off that the police are investigating the bank, though they don't know how much we know. They're going to empty all the deposit boxes they've been using to store stolen goods and documents, destroy the evidence, and disappear. But you can arrest them tomorrow night when they come," Eleanor said. "We could, but we'd only catch the men doing the physical work. The subordinates, the real criminals, the ones running the operation, will never set foot in that bank. They'll send their underlings to take the fall while they escape with the profits." Hartley's jaw tightened with frustration. "I've spent 6 months tracking these people, Miss Thorne. They're responsible for smuggling operations, theft, extortion. They've ruined lives and destroyed families. I need evidence that connects the leaders to the crimes, not just their hired hands." Eleanor's quick mind was already working through the problem. "The evidence you need, it's in those deposit boxes. Some of it, yes. Documents, ledgers, correspondence that would prove the connection. But I can't get a warrant to open them without revealing what we know. And the moment I do that, the evidence will disappear." Hartley looked at her intently, and Eleanor felt the full weight of his gaze. "Miss Thorne, I need your help." "My help?" Eleanor's voice came out higher than she intended. "Detective Hartley, I'm a bookkeeper. What could I possibly do? You have access to the bank. You have a key to your family's deposit box. And you have something else. Courage and integrity. I saw it 3 nights ago when you chose to protect my investigation rather than expose it." Hartley moved around the table so nothing stood between them. "I need someone on the inside tomorrow night. Someone who has a legitimate reason to be in that vault room. Someone who can help me document what happens. Who can be a witness to what's taken from those boxes." Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. "You want me to spy on criminals? Detective, these are dangerous men. If they discovered what I was doing, I would never let any harm come to you." Hartley interrupted, and the fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised them both. He cleared his throat and continued more professionally. "I will be there as well, hidden in that passage. You would be perfectly safe. All I need is for you to be in the vault room at 9 o'clock tomorrow night, accessing your own deposit box. If questioned, you'll say you had to work late and this was the only time you could come. While you're there, you'll observe who enters, what boxes they access, and what they remove. I'll be watching through the false box, and I'll have officers stationed throughout the building. Why not simply hide in the vault room yourself? Eleanor asked. Because the bank manager Caldwell has been checking the vault room every hour since my investigation became known to him. We believe he's the one who tipped off the criminals. If he finds me hiding there, the entire operation will be called off and we'll lose everything. But you, Miss Thorne, have every right to be there. You're a legitimate customer. Eleanor turned away from him, walking to the far wall of the small room. Her reflection looked back at her from the framed print of a sailing ship that hung there. A young woman with troubled eyes and a face that showed the strain of recent weeks. She thought of her father, saved from ruin by the sacrifice of her mother's necklace. She thought of her brother James, safe now from the men who had threatened him. Her family had been victims of cruel men who preyed on the vulnerable. And now this detective was asking her to help stop such men from destroying other families. If I do this, she said slowly, not turning around, and something goes wrong, if these criminals realize what's happening, my family could be at risk. My father has only just recovered from his business troubles. Another scandal, or worse, violence. She heard Hartley move behind her, close but not touching. His voice was gentle when he spoke. Miss Thorne, Eleanor, I understand your fear. I understand what I'm asking of you. If you say no, I will walk out of this room and never trouble you again. I'll find another way, though it may take months or years. But I'm asking because I believe you're the kind of person who wants to make a difference in this world. I saw it in your eyes that night. You're not someone who can walk away when you have the power to help. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words resonate through her. She had always been the responsible one in her family, the one who solved problems and made difficult choices. It was why she had been willing to sell her mother's necklace, why she worked long hours at Morrison & Sons to help support the household, why she had shouldered burdens that should never have fallen to a young woman alone. But this was different. This was choosing to walk into danger, choosing to confront criminals who would not hesitate to harm her if they discovered her purpose. And yet she thought of James Hartley standing in that dark passage, dedicating months of his life to bringing justice to people he had never met. She thought of the families who would suffer if these criminals escaped. She thought of the kind of woman she wanted to be, and the kind of world she wanted to live in. Eleanor turned to face the detective and was surprised to find him much closer than she had realized. She could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. His gray eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. I'll do it, she said quietly. I'll help you. The relief that flooded Hartley's features was profound. Thank you, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. Eleanor, I swear to you, I will not let anything happen to you. I'll be there every moment, watching. The slightest hint of danger, and I'll intervene immediately. I believe you, Eleanor said, and realized with some surprise that she truly did. There was something about this man that inspired trust, something beyond his badge and his duty. She saw in him a fundamental decency, a commitment to protecting the innocent that went beyond professional obligation. And she felt, in a way she couldn't quite explain, that their meeting 3 nights ago had not been mere chance but something more significant, the beginning of a connection that neither of them fully understood yet. We need to discuss the details, Hartley said, though he seemed reluctant to break the moment between them. Tomorrow evening, you'll arrive at the bank at precisely 9 o'clock. That's when we expect the criminals to make their move. You'll go directly to the vault room and access your deposit box. Do you still have anything in it? Eleanor shook her head. No. I took everything when I... She stopped, realizing she had nearly revealed her desperate financial situation. Hartley's perceptive eyes caught the hesitation. When you took your mother's necklace to sell it, he said gently. Eleanor, I'm a detective. I saw the empty box, and I saw the desperation in your eyes that night. I know financial trouble when I see it. There's no shame in doing what you must to protect your family. Eleanor felt unexpected tears prick her eyes at his understanding. My father's business nearly collapsed. Dangerous men were threatening my brother. The necklace was all we had left of value. I had no choice. You always have a choice, Hartley said softly. You chose to protect those you love. That takes courage. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This is evidence from another case. Jewelry recovered from a theft, already documented and photographed. Tomorrow night, I want you to place this in your deposit box before you go to the bank. That way, you'll have a legitimate reason to access it. When you're in the vault room, take your time examining these pieces. That will give you an excuse to remain there while the criminals do their work." Eleanor took the pouch, feeling the weight of several pieces of jewelry inside. "And what exactly should I be watching for?" "Note everything. Who enters the vault room, which boxes they open, what they remove, any conversations you overhear. But above all, be natural. If anyone questions you, you're simply a customer taking care of personal business. Don't try to be heroic. Don't confront anyone. Just observe and remember." Hartley's expression grew serious. "And Eleanor, if at any moment you feel threatened or afraid, you say the word assistance. Say it clearly, in any context that makes sense, and I'll be there in seconds with armed officers. Do you understand?" "I understand," Eleanor said, though her heart was racing at the reality of what she had agreed to. "One more thing," Hartley said, and now something new entered his voice, something personal beneath the professional concern. "After tomorrow night, when this is over, I'd like to speak with you again. Not as a detective and a witness, but as—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "As two people who have shared something significant. Would that be acceptable to you?" Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. In the 3 days since their first meeting, she had tried to convince herself that her constant thoughts of him were merely the result of the dramatic circumstances. But standing here now, seeing the way he looked at her with such careful respect and barely concealed interest, she knew it was more than that. Something had sparked between them in that dark passage, something that had nothing to do with criminals and investigations and everything to do with two souls recognizing something kindred in each other. "Yes," she said softly, "I would like that very much, Detective Hartley." "James," he said, "when this is over, I hope you'll call me James." "Then you must call me Eleanor." They stood there for a moment longer, neither quite willing to break the spell of intimacy that had settled over them in this small room. Then Hartley cleared his throat and stepped back, restoring proper distance between them. "I should let you return to your work before Mr. Morrison becomes suspicious," he said, his voice returning to its professional tone. "Tomorrow night, 9 o'clock, at the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank. I'll see you there." "Tomorrow night," Eleanor confirmed. She moved toward the door, but Hartley's voice stopped her. "Eleanor, thank you. For trusting me. For being brave enough to help. You're remarkable." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with warmth. She turned back to give him a small smile. "I hope tomorrow night proves you right about that, James." Then she slipped out of the conference room and returned to her desk, where the mundane world of ledgers and invoices awaited. But nothing felt mundane anymore. In the space of 3 days, her life had transformed from one of quiet desperation to something else entirely, something dangerous and thrilling and unexpectedly alive with possibility. Tomorrow night would determine many things: the success of James Hartley's investigation, the fate of criminals who preyed on the innocent, and perhaps, she dared to hope, the future of whatever was growing between a dedicated detective and a bookkeeper who had chosen courage over caution. As Eleanor bent over her ledgers, she found herself unable to suppress a small smile. For the first time in months, she felt something beyond mere survival. She felt hope, purpose, and the beginning of something that felt remarkably like falling in love. The evening of November 15th arrived with an unseasonable fog that rolled in from Boston Harbor, wrapping the city in a thick gray shroud that muffled sound and obscured vision beyond a few feet. Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting her hat for the 3rd time, her fingers trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. She wore a practical navy wool suit with a high collar and leg of mutton sleeves, appropriate for a business transaction but nothing that would draw unwanted attention. The velvet pouch James had given her rested in her handbag, along with the key to her family's deposit box. "Eleanor, are you certain you must go out in this dreadful fog?" her father called from downstairs. Thomas Thorne had recovered much of his vigor since the debt had been paid, though gray streaks in his dark beard showed the toll recent months had taken. "The streets will be treacherous." "I must, Father," Eleanor replied, descending the stairs of their modest townhouse on Pinckney Street. "There are important papers I need from the bank, and tomorrow I'll be working late on the quarterly reports. This is my only opportunity." Her younger brother James looked up from his school books at the dining table. At 16, he was already tall and broad-shouldered, showing promise of the man he would become. "I could accompany you, Eleanor. A lady shouldn't walk alone after dark." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt at the concern in her brother's eyes. "Thank you, dear, but it's only a short walk to Tremont Street, and I'll hire a handsome cab for the return journey. I'll be perfectly safe." If only that were true, she thought as she pulled on her gloves and coat. But she had made her choice, and she would see it through. As she stepped out into the foggy evening, the gas lamps along Beacon Hill created islands of hazy light in the surrounding darkness. The fog pressed close, damp and cold, carrying with it the smell of the sea and coal smoke from countless chimneys. Eleanor's footsteps echoed on the brick sidewalks as she made her way down the hill toward the financial district. She arrived at the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank at precisely 9 o'clock, as James had instructed. The building loomed out of the fog like a granite fortress, its windows glowing with electric light. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy doors. The banking hall was nearly empty at this hour, with only a single clerk visible behind the main counter, and the night guard, an elderly man named Sullivan, stationed near the entrance. "Good evening, Miss Thorne," Sullivan said, touching his cap. He knew her from her previous visits. "Late hours for banking business?" "Yes, I'm afraid my work schedule leaves me little choice," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "I need to access my deposit box." "Of course, miss. I'll fetch young Brennan to escort you to the vault." Eleanor waited in the marble-floored hall, her eyes scanning the interior for any sign of James or the criminals he had warned her about. Everything appeared normal. Too normal, perhaps. The ornate clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet space, marking each second that brought her closer to whatever was about to unfold. A thin young clerk she didn't recognize appeared from a back office. "Miss Thorne, I'm Edward Brennan's cousin filling in for the evening. If you'll follow me." Eleanor followed him through the familiar route to the vault room, acutely aware of every detail: the clerk's nervous manner, the way his eyes darted toward the shadows, the slight tremor in his hands as he used the keys to open the vault door. Was he part of the criminal operation, or simply anxious about working late in the fog-shrouded building? The circular vault room was exactly as Eleanor remembered it, lined with brass-faced deposit boxes of various sizes. The clerk retrieved box 47 and placed it on the mahogany table. "Ring the bell when you're finished, miss," he said, and departed with unseemly haste. Eleanor was alone. She opened the box and carefully placed the jewelry from James's velvet pouch inside, making a show of examining each piece, even though her attention was fixed on the deposit box across the room, number 93, the false box that concealed the passage. It remained closed, but Eleanor knew James was there, watching through some hidden viewport, ready to intervene if she needed him. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. 10 minutes passed. 15. Eleanor was beginning to wonder if the criminals had changed their plans when she heard voices in the outer hall. The vault door swung open, and 3 men entered. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she recognized the first. It was Caldwell, the bank manager, his silver mutton chops and portly figure unmistakable. Behind him came 2 rough-looking men in workmen's clothes, carrying empty carpet bags. Caldwell stopped short when he saw Eleanor at the table. His face, already florid, turned a deeper shade of red. "Miss Thorne, what are you doing here at this hour?" Eleanor forced herself to appear merely surprised, not terrified. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell. I might ask you the same question. I came to retrieve some jewelry. My employer requires me to attend a formal reception tomorrow evening." The lie came more easily than she had expected. Caldwell's small eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I see. Well, please complete your business quickly. The bank is closing soon, and we have—" He glanced at his companions. "Maintenance work to perform in this room." "Of course," Eleanor said, turning back to her deposit box with hands that she willed not to shake. Behind her, she heard Caldwell whispering urgently to the 2 men. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain they must hear it. She pretended to examine a bracelet from the collection, watching their reflection in the polished brass of the deposit boxes. The 2 workmen moved to several of the larger boxes in sequence, numbers 87, 91, 95. They used keys that Caldwell provided, opening each box and removing bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Eleanor caught glimpses of documents, small wooden boxes, and what appeared to be bags of coins or jewelry. Everything went into the carpet bags with practiced efficiency. These men had done this before. "Miss Thorne, surely you've had time enough to select your jewelry." Caldwell said, his voice carrying a note of impatience and threat. Just another moment, Eleanor replied, her mind racing. She needed to give James more time to observe and document what was being taken. I'm having difficulty with the clasp on this necklace. The mechanism seemed stuck. She heard Caldwell's footsteps approaching behind her, and her entire body tensed. This was the moment James had warned her about, when she must seem natural, unafraid, innocent of any knowledge of wrongdoing. She looked up at Caldwell with what she hoped was a helpless expression. Perhaps you could assist me? I don't want to damage it. Caldwell's suspicious expression softened slightly at her apparent helplessness. He was a man who expected women to be incompetent with mechanical things. Let me see, he said gruffly, coming to stand beside her at the table. While Caldwell fumbled with the necklace clasp, Eleanor's eyes darted past him to where the two workmen continued their systematic emptying of deposit boxes. She committed every detail to memory, the specific boxes they opened, the types of bundles they removed, the careful way they wrapped everything to prevent noise or damage. One of the men caught her watching and gave her a hard stare that made her quickly look away. There, Caldwell said, finally freeing the clasp. These modern mechanisms can be temperamental. Thank you so much, Eleanor said, taking back the necklace. I'm very grateful for your assistance. The word hung in the air. Assistance. The signal James had told her to use if she felt threatened. Eleanor hadn't meant to say it, but it had slipped out naturally in her nervousness. She held her breath, wondering if James had heard, if he would burst through the false deposit box with officers in tow. Nothing happened. The moment stretched out in terrible silence. Caldwell was staring at her with renewed suspicion, his eyes boring into her face as if trying to read her thoughts. The two workmen had stopped their work and were watching her as well. Eleanor realized with a sinking feeling that they had recognized the word as a signal, or at least as something out of place, something wrong. You seem nervous, Miss Thorne, Caldwell said slowly. Is something troubling you? Eleanor's mind worked frantically. She had to salvage this situation, had to explain away her nervousness in a way that would satisfy them. I apologize, Mr. Caldwell. The truth is, I'm quite embarrassed. This jewelry, she gestured to the pieces on the table. These aren't mine. They belong to a gentleman friend who asked me to store them for him. I'm retrieving them tonight because he's requested them back, and I've realized that storing another person's valuables in my family's deposit box was probably improper. I was worried you might report me for misuse of the box. It was a desperate gambit, but Eleanor delivered it with what she hoped was convincing shame and anxiety. Caldwell studied her for a long moment, then suddenly laughed, a harsh barking sound. My dear Miss Thorne, I'm hardly in a position to judge the improper use of deposit boxes, am I? He glanced at his companions and their carpet bags full of stolen goods, and laughed again. No, indeed. Your secret is safe with me. The threat in his words was unmistakable. He was admitting his own criminality, but also making clear that she was now implicated, that they shared guilty knowledge. If she spoke of what she had seen, he could speak of her supposed impropriety. It was, Eleanor realized, a test, and also a warning. Thank you for your understanding, Eleanor said quietly, gathering the jewelry back into the velvet pouch. I'll leave you to your maintenance work. Yes, I think that would be wise, Caldwell said. And Miss Thorne? Perhaps it's best if you don't mention seeing us here this evening. Bank security matters are quite confidential, you understand. Of course, Eleanor agreed, moving toward the door. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to walk calmly, naturally. As she reached for the door handle, one of the workmen called out, "Wait!" Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly to face the man who had spoken, a burly fellow with a scarred face and cold eyes. He was staring at her with undisguised suspicion. That jewelry you got there. Let me see it. I beg your pardon, Eleanor said, drawing herself up with as much dignity as she could muster. You heard me. Show me what's in that pouch. Caldwell looked uncertain now, clearly worried about how far his men might go. Now see here. There's no need. The girl's nervous. The scarred man interrupted. Too nervous for someone just picking up jewelry. And that word she said. Assistance. That's copper's talk. I've heard it before. Eleanor's heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. This was falling apart, and she could sense the danger rising in the room like floodwater. She opened the velvet pouch and dumped the jewelry onto the table. Here. It's just jewelry, as I said. Now may I please leave? The scarred man moved closer, examining the pieces. His companion had set down his carpet bag and was blocking the door. Eleanor realized with growing horror that they weren't going to let her leave. They suspected she was there to spy on them, and they couldn't afford to take chances. These pieces, I've seen them before, the scarred man said slowly. They were in the evidence room at the police station. I remember because I was there last year on an unrelated matter, and I saw them in a display case. Recovered stolen property, they said. His eyes locked onto Eleanor's face with terrible certainty.
You're working with the coppers. The vault room exploded into action. Caldwell stumbled backward, his face gone white. The second workman lunged toward Eleanor, reaching for her arm. And in that moment, the false deposit box, number 93, burst open with a crash of brass and wood. James Hartley came through the opening like an avenging angel, his service revolver drawn, his gray eyes blazing with fury and determination. Boston police, nobody move.
But the criminals were already moving. The scarred man reached into his coat, pulling out a pistol. Caldwell was running for the door, shouting for help. The second workman had seized Eleanor's arm in a grip of iron, dragging her toward him as a human shield. Eleanor screamed and fought, her training as a proper lady forgotten in the instinct for survival. James didn't hesitate. He aimed his revolver not at the man holding Eleanor, but at the scarred man raising his pistol. "Drop it now, or I'll shoot." The scarred man's answer was to fire. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, and Eleanor saw James dive to the side as the bullet sparked off the brass door frames. Then James returned fire, and the scarred man cried out, his pistol clattering to the floor as he clutched his shoulder. "Let her go!" James roared at the man holding Eleanor. His voice carried such command, such barely controlled violence, that the workman actually loosened his grip. It was enough. Eleanor drove her elbow backward into the man's ribs with all her strength, breaking free. She ran toward James, and he caught her with his free arm, pulling her behind him while keeping his revolver trained on the criminals. Whistles were blowing throughout the building now. Heavy footsteps pounded in the corridor outside. The vault door burst open and uniformed police officers flooded in, weapons drawn. The second workman raised his hands in surrender. The scarred man was writhing on the floor, blood seeping through his fingers from his wounded shoulder. And Caldwell had vanished in the confusion. "Officer Ryan, secure these two," James ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "Get a doctor for the wounded man. And someone find Caldwell. He can't have gone far." He turned to Eleanor, his free hand coming up to cup her face, his eyes searching hers frantically. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" "I'm fine," Eleanor managed, though she was shaking violently now that the danger had passed. "James, I'm so sorry. I said the word. I didn't mean to. It just slipped out." "Shh, it's all right," James said, holstering his weapon and pulling her into a proper embrace. Eleanor felt his heart pounding against her cheek, felt the strength of his arms around her, and suddenly she was crying. Great, gasping sobs of relief and delayed terror and overwhelming emotion. "I've got you," James murmured against her hair. "You're safe now. You're safe." An older officer with sergeant's stripes approached them, tactfully clearing his throat. "Detective Hartley, we found Caldwell trying to escape through the back entrance. He's in custody. What about the evidence?" James reluctantly released Eleanor, though he kept one hand on her shoulder, as if afraid to let her go completely. "The carpet bag's there. They contain documents and valuables taken from multiple deposit boxes. I want everything photographed and cataloged before it's moved, and I want a complete list of which boxes were accessed." He looked at Eleanor, his expression softening. "Miss Thorne witnessed the entire operation. Her testimony will be crucial." The sergeant nodded, giving Eleanor a respectful look. "Miss, you're very brave. The city owes you a debt of gratitude." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I only did what Detective Hartley asked of me." "You did far more than that," James said quietly. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made the chaos around them seem to fade. "Eleanor, when I saw that man grab you, when I heard that gunshot," he stopped, seeming to struggle with his emotions. "I've never been so frightened in my life." Before Eleanor could respond, another officer called out, "Detective Hartley, we found something. You need to see this." James squeezed Eleanor's shoulder gently. "Wait here. I'll return in just a moment." Eleanor watched him stride across the vault room to where officers were examining the contents of one of the carpet bags. They pulled out a leather-bound ledger, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see James's expression transform into one of fierce satisfaction. He opened the ledger, flipped through several pages, then looked up at his men with something like triumph in his eyes. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "This ledger contains records of every smuggling shipment, every bribe, every transaction. And look here," he pointed to a page, "the names of everyone involved in the operation, including several men we've been trying to connect to organized crime for years. This is exactly what we needed." The sergeant clapped James on the shoulder. "6 months of work, Hartley, and you've finally got them. The commissioner will be pleased." But James wasn't looking at the ledger anymore. He was looking at Eleanor, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. He crossed the vault room to her side, seemingly oblivious to the controlled chaos around them, officers securing evidence, the wounded man being carried out on a stretcher, the flash powder of a police photographer capturing the scene. "Eleanor," James said, and his voice was low, meant only for her. "I need to say something, and I need to say it now, before I lose my nerve or before duty calls me away again." "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her heart beginning to race for an entirely different reason than fear. "When I asked for your help, I had no right to endanger you the way I did tonight. I told myself it was necessary for the investigation, that you were the only person who could help me. But the truth is," James paused, searching for words, "from the moment I pulled you through that false deposit box 3 nights ago, from the moment I looked into your eyes and saw courage and kindness and intelligence, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her entire body despite the cold vault room. "James, let me finish," he said gently. "Tonight, watching you maintain your composure in front of those criminals, watching you think quickly and bravely even when you were terrified, I realized something. I didn't just ask for your help because you had access to this bank. I asked because I wanted a reason to see you again, to spend time with you, to be part of your life." His hand came up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I fell in love with you, Eleanor Thorne, somewhere between that first moment in the darkness and this moment now. And I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. But I also know that what I feel is real and true, and I couldn't bear not telling you." Eleanor's tears returned, but now they were tears of joy. "James, I feel the same way. I've been trying to convince myself it was impossible, that we'd only met twice, that you were a detective, and I was just a bookkeeper caught up in your investigation. But my heart knew better. My heart knew from that first moment, when you trusted me with your secret and I trusted you with mine." James smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his serious face into something beautiful. "Then may I court you properly? May I call on you at your home, take you to dinner, spend time getting to know everything about you that I don't already know?" "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, James Hartley, you may court me." He looked like he wanted to kiss her, and Eleanor thought she might have let him despite the impropriety and the dozen police officers working around them. But duty called in the form of the sergeant returning with more questions about evidence and testimony. James squeezed her hand one more time, his eyes promising that this conversation would continue later, and then turned back to his work. 6 weeks had passed since the night at the Massachusetts Trust and Savings Bank, and Boston had settled into the deep cold of late December. Snow blanketed the city in pristine white, transforming the brick buildings and cobblestone streets into something from a winter fairy tale. Gas lamps cast golden pools of light onto the snow-covered sidewalks, and the shop windows along Tremont Street were decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons in preparation for Christmas. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the emerald green silk gown she wore. It was the finest dress she owned, purchased years ago for a cousin's wedding and carefully preserved for special occasions. Tonight was certainly special. James had invited her to the Boston Police Department's annual Christmas gala, and she would be attending as his official guest. More than that, she would be recognized publicly as the woman who had helped bring down one of the city's most dangerous criminal operations. The trial of Caldwell and his associates had concluded just 3 days ago. The evidence Eleanor had witnessed being removed from the deposit boxes, combined with the detailed ledger James had recovered, had proven devastating to the defense. All three men had been convicted on multiple charges: smuggling, theft, bribery, and conspiracy. Caldwell had received 15 years in prison, while the two workmen had each received 10. More importantly, the ledger had led to the arrest of 5 other men, including a corrupt city official and 2 prominent businessmen who had been financing the smuggling operation. Eleanor had testified at the trial, standing before the court and calmly recounting everything she had witnessed that November night. It had been terrifying to face the defendants and their lawyers, but James had been there throughout, his steady presence giving her strength. The newspapers had hailed her as a heroine, much to her embarrassment, and Morrison & Sons had received so much positive attention from her involvement that Edmund Morrison had given her a substantial raise and promotion to head bookkeeper. But more precious than public recognition or professional advancement was the relationship that had blossomed between Eleanor and James over the past 6 weeks. True to his word, James had courted her properly, calling at her home to meet her father and brother, taking her to dinner at respectable restaurants, accompanying her to the theater, and spending long hours simply talking with her about everything and nothing. Thomas Thorne had been initially suspicious of a police detective courting his daughter, but James's obvious respect for Eleanor and his forthright manner had won the older man over. Young James had been even easier to impress, fascinated by the detective's stories and already declaring that he hoped to join the police force himself one day. With each passing day, Eleanor had fallen more deeply in love with James Hartley. She loved his dedication to justice, his protective nature, his sharp intelligence, and the dry humor that emerged when he felt comfortable enough to let his guard down. She loved the way he listened to her opinions as if they mattered, the way he asked about her work and treated her as an intellectual equal. She loved his strength and his gentleness, the way he could command a room full of rough criminals and then turn to her with eyes full of tenderness. And she was fairly certain, from the way James looked at her, that he felt the same depth of emotion. But he had not yet spoken the words again, not since that chaotic night in the vault room. Eleanor understood that he was being proper, allowing their courtship to develop naturally, but part of her ached to hear him say once more that he loved her. "Eleanor, Detective Hartley is here," her brother called up the stairs. Eleanor's heart leaped. She gave herself one final look in the mirror, tucked a loose strand of auburn hair back into place, and descended the stairs. James stood in the entrance hall looking devastatingly handsome in formal evening wear, a black tailcoat with silk lapels, a white waistcoat, and a perfectly knotted white bow tie. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his gray eyes lit up with unmistakable admiration when he saw her. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you look absolutely beautiful." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks. "You're quite distinguished yourself, Detective Hartley." "Oh, it's Detective Hartley now, is it?" James said with a slight smile. "I thought we'd moved past such formality. Perhaps I'm nervous about this evening," Eleanor admitted. "Meeting all your colleagues, being the center of attention." James stepped closer and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "You have nothing to be nervous about. They already admire you greatly for what you did. And besides, I'll be with you the entire evening. I won't let you out of my sight." Thomas Thorne emerged from the parlor, looking pleased. "You young people have a wonderful time. Eleanor, mind you're home by midnight. That's late enough for proper young ladies." "Yes, father," Eleanor said, accepting her wool cloak from young James, who was watching the couple with barely concealed excitement. The carriage James had hired, a luxury he had insisted upon for such a special evening, waited outside in the snow. He helped Eleanor into the velvet-upholstered interior and settled beside her, tucking a fur lap blanket around them both against the cold. As the horses began their careful progress through the snowy streets toward the Old South Meeting House, where the gala was being held, Eleanor felt a contentment settle over her that she had never experienced before. This, she thought, was what happiness felt like. Being beside the person you loved, anticipating an evening together, knowing you were valued and cherished. "Eleanor," James said quietly as the carriage moved through the winter night, "there's something I want to discuss with you before we arrive at the gala." Eleanor turned to him, noting the slight nervousness in his expression. "What is it?" "I've been offered a promotion," James said. "Chief of Detectives. It's a significant advancement. More responsibility, better pay, the opportunity to lead major investigations rather than just participating in them." "James, that's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed. "You deserve it after the success of the smuggling case. Why do you seem uncertain?" James was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. "Because accepting this position means committing to a life that's unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. It means irregular hours, cases that might keep me away from home for days or weeks at a time, and enemies, criminals who might hold grudges, who might seek revenge." He looked up at her, his gray eyes intense. "Eleanor, I need to know if that's a life you could accept, because I find myself unable to imagine my future without you in it." Eleanor's breath caught. "James, are you asking?" "Not yet," he said quickly, a slight smile touching his lips. "Not quite yet. I want to do this properly, and there are certain traditions I intend to follow. But I need to know before I make this commitment to the police department that you understand what being with me would mean. I need to know if you're willing to share that life." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw everything she needed to know: love, hope, fear of rejection, and a vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to see. She squeezed his hand tightly. "James, I fell in love with a detective. Not with someone who works regular hours in a safe occupation. I fell in love with a man who dedicates his life to protecting the innocent and bringing criminals to justice. That's who you are, and I wouldn't want you to be anyone else. Even knowing the sacrifices that would require," James pressed, "the worry you might feel when I'm working dangerous cases." "I would worry," Eleanor admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I would also be proud, and I would trust you to be careful and to come home to me." She paused, then added softly, "My mother used to say that loving someone means accepting all of them, their strengths and their flaws, their calling and their complications. I accept all of you, James Hartley." James raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her gloved knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're remarkable," he murmured. "Absolutely remarkable." The carriage arrived at the Old South Meeting House, pulling up before the historic building where patriots had once gathered to protest British taxation. Tonight, it was decorated with evergreen wreaths and lit from within by hundreds of candles and electric lights. Other carriages lined the street, discharging elegantly dressed guests who climbed the steps into the warmth and music within. James helped Eleanor down from the carriage, and together they entered the building. The main hall had been transformed into a glittering ballroom, with a small orchestra playing at one end and long tables laden with refreshments along the walls. Police officers in dress uniforms mingled with their wives and guests, and Eleanor recognized several faces from the trial: the sergeant who had worked with James, the commissioner himself, various detectives and patrolmen. The moment they entered, heads turned. Conversations paused. Then the commissioner, a distinguished man with silver hair and a magnificent mustache, approached them with a broad smile. "Detective Hartley, and this must be the famous Miss Thorne. My dear young lady, the entire department has been eager to meet you properly and express our gratitude." He bowed over her hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "What you did required tremendous courage. Boston is safer because of citizens like you." "You're too kind, Commissioner," Eleanor said, feeling overwhelmed by his praise. "I simply did what Detective Hartley asked of me." "She's being modest," James said, his voice warm with pride. "Miss Thorne showed initiative, intelligence, and remarkable composure under pressure. The success of that operation was as much her achievement as mine." Other officers and their families came forward to be introduced, and Eleanor found herself the center of attention in a way that was both flattering and slightly uncomfortable. But James remained at her side throughout, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture of support and possession that made her feel protected and valued. After an hour of conversation and introductions, the orchestra struck up a waltz. James turned to Eleanor with a slight bow. "May I have the honor of this dance?" "I would be delighted," Eleanor replied, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they began to move together in the graceful three-quarter time, Eleanor was impressed by James's skill. "You dance very well," she observed. "My mother insisted I learn," James said with a slight smile. "She believed that a gentleman should be able to move with grace on the dance floor as well as on the street. I thought it foolishness at the time, but now I'm grateful." They moved together in smooth synchronization, and Eleanor felt as though they were alone despite the dozens of other couples swirling around them. James held her at the proper distance for propriety, but his eyes conveyed what his touch could not: desire, love, and a promise of future intimacy. Eleanor felt heat bloom in her chest and spread through her entire body. "You're thinking something," James observed. "I can see it in your eyes." "I was thinking about the night we met," Eleanor admitted. "How terrified I was when you pulled me through that false deposit box. How impossible it seemed that anything good could come from such a frightening situation. And now," James prompted softly. "And now I can't imagine my life without you in it." James's grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor, there's another reason I wanted you to attend this gala tonight. I have something planned, something I hope you'll find acceptable." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, the music ended. The commissioner stepped up to a small podium at the front of the hall and called for everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, turning toward him expectantly. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure this evening to recognize two individuals whose courage and dedication exemplify the very best of civic duty. As you all know, 6 weeks ago, we successfully concluded an investigation into a major smuggling and criminal conspiracy operating within our city. This investigation resulted in multiple arrests and convictions and has made Boston significantly safer for all its citizens." The commissioner gestured toward James and Eleanor. Detective James Hartley led this investigation with skill and determination over the course of 6 months. His innovative approach and unwavering commitment to justice brought dangerous criminals to account, and Miss Eleanor Thorne, an ordinary citizen who found herself unexpectedly involved in this investigation, displayed extraordinary courage in assisting Detective Hartley at considerable personal risk. Applause filled the hall, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and pride. James stood beside her, tall and confident, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "It's therefore my honor," the commissioner continued, "to present Detective Hartley with a commendation for exceptional service." An aide brought forward a framed certificate, which the commissioner presented to James with a firm handshake. "And to present Miss Thorne with the Boston Police Department Citizen Award for Bravery. The first time in 20 years this honor has been bestowed." Eleanor stepped forward in a daze to accept her own certificate, mounted in an elegant silver frame. The applause grew louder, and she saw genuine respect and admiration in the faces around her. When she returned to James's side, he leaned close and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." The commissioner raised his hand for silence once more. "There's one more announcement I'd like to make this evening. It gives me great pleasure to inform you all that Detective Hartley has accepted the position of Chief of Detectives, effective January 1st. He will be the youngest man to hold this position in the history of the department, but I have no doubt he will serve with distinction." More applause erupted, louder and more enthusiastic than before. Officers crowded forward to shake James's hand and offer congratulations. Eleanor stood slightly aside, watching the man she loved receive the recognition he so richly deserved, feeling joy and pride swell within her heart. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversation, dancing, and celebration. But finally, as midnight approached, James collected Eleanor's cloak and escorted her out to their waiting carriage. The snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting down through the darkness like pieces of starlight. As the carriage began the journey back to Beacon Hill, James suddenly called to the driver, "Take us through the common, please, the long way around." The driver touched his hat in acknowledgement, turning the horses toward Boston Common. The great park was transformed by snow into a winter wonderland, the bare trees frosted white, and the paths lit by gas lamps that created pools of golden light. The carriage moved slowly through this enchanted landscape, and Eleanor understood that James wanted these few extra minutes alone with her. "Eleanor," James said, turning to face her in the intimate confines of the carriage, "6 weeks ago, in a moment of danger and chaos, I told you I loved you. I've been waiting for the right moment to say it again properly, in circumstances worthy of what I feel." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Eleanor's breath stopped as he opened it to reveal a gold ring set with a modest but beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. The gems caught the lamplight filtering through the carriage windows and sparkled like captured stars. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," James said softly. "She was the strongest, wisest woman I ever knew, and she taught me what it meant to love honorably and truly. When she died 2 years ago, she left this to me with instructions that I should give it only to a woman I loved with my whole heart, a woman who would be my partner in all things." James took Eleanor's hand in his gray eyes luminous with emotion. "Eleanor Thorne, you are that woman. You're brave and intelligent and compassionate. You challenge me and support me in equal measure. You make me want to be a better man than I am. I love you with everything I am, and I cannot imagine facing the future without you by my side." He paused, taking a breath, and Eleanor realized he was nervous. This strong, confident detective was nervous asking her to marry him. The realization touched her deeply. "Eleanor," James continued, his voice rough with emotion, "will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you so much." James's face transformed with relief and happiness. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her, and then pulled her into his arms. This time, there were no police officers watching, no propriety to restrain them. James kissed her with all the passion and tenderness he had been holding back for weeks, and Eleanor kissed him in return, pouring 6 weeks of love and longing into that embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed. James rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face. "I promise I will spend the rest of my life making you happy," he said. "I promise to love you and protect you and honor you above all others." "And I promise the same to you," Eleanor replied. "We'll face whatever comes together. The dangerous cases, the irregular hours, all of it, together." The carriage completed its circuit of the common and began the final approach to Beacon Hill. James reluctantly released Eleanor from his embrace, though he kept her hand clasped in his thumb stroking over the sapphire ring. "When shall we marry?" he asked. "I don't want to wait long." "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted, "but we should do this properly. We need time for the banns to be posted, for my father to arrange things, for me to prepare. Perhaps early spring? April?" "April," James agreed, though his expression suggested he found even that relatively short wait almost unbearable. 3.5 months. I suppose I can survive that long." Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter and happier than she had ever felt in her life. "I think you can manage, Chief of Detectives Hartley." The carriage pulled up before the Thorne home on Pinckney Street. Lights still burned in the windows. Her father and brother had clearly waited up to hear about the evening. James helped Eleanor down from the carriage and walked her to the door, both of them reluctant to part despite the late hour and the cold. "I should speak to your father properly," James said. "Ask for his blessing, though I confess I've already proposed without it." "He'll give his blessing gladly," Eleanor assured him. "He already thinks of you as family." James kissed her once more, gently this time, a promise of all the kisses to come. "I love you, Eleanor Hartley to be." "I love you, James," Eleanor replied. "Now go home before we both freeze." She watched as he returned to the carriage, turning to wave before the vehicle pulled away into the snowy night. Then Eleanor entered her home, where her father and brother immediately descended upon her with questions about the evening. She showed them the certificate, told them about the honors and James's promotion, and finally, with a radiant smile, held out her left hand to display the sapphire ring. Thomas Thorne embraced his daughter with tears in his eyes. "Your mother would be so happy," he said gruffly. "James Hartley is a good man, Eleanor. He'll take care of you." Young James was beside himself with excitement. "Does this mean Detective Hartley will be my brother? That's the best thing ever." Eleanor laughed and hugged them both. Later, lying in her bed with moonlight streaming through her window and the sapphire ring glinting on her finger, she thought back over the extraordinary journey that had begun just 6 weeks ago. She had entered that bank vault prepared to sacrifice her mother's necklace, the last precious thing she owned, to save her family. She had stumbled into a detective's investigation and chosen loyalty over safety, and in making that choice, she had found not just purpose and courage, but love. The safe had been left open on purpose. She had chosen loyalty, and James Hartley had chosen her. Eleanor smiled in the darkness and drifted off to sleep, dreaming of spring weddings and a future filled with love, partnership, and the kind of happiness she had once thought impossible. The past 6 weeks had taught her that the best things in life often came from the most unexpected circumstances, and that courage, whether in facing criminals or opening one's heart to love, was always rewarded. In his own modest apartment across the city, James Hartley lay awake thinking of Eleanor, of the feel of her in his arms, of the joy on her face when she had accepted his proposal. He thought of the life they would build together, of coming home to her after difficult cases, of sharing both triumphs and sorrows. He thought of the children they might have, of growing old together, of loving her more with each passing year. He had been a detective for 8 years, had solved countless cases, had brought numerous criminals to justice, but none of those achievements compared to winning Eleanor Thorne's love. She was his greatest success, his most precious treasure, his future, and his home. As snow continued to fall over Boston, blanketing the city in peaceful white, two people in different parts of the city fell asleep thinking of each other, bound together by love and trust and a shared future that promised to be extraordinary. The story that had begun with an open safe and a choice of loyalty had ended exactly as the best stories should, with two hearts joined together, with justice served, and with the promise of happily ever after.